The all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God falls apart the moment you shine even a little bit of light on it. And not the polite light, not the soft glow from a Sunday sermon. I'm talking about the floodlight of logic, the kind of light that burns away excuses, the kind of light religions hope you never turn on. So let's start right where it hurts the most. The concept of God collapses under its own definitions. Not because of opinions. Not because of emotions. But because the definitions themselves contradict each other in ways so obvious it's almost insulting that people were told to ignore them. On the throne sits a being who is supposedly omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. 3 absolute traits. Unlimited power. Unlimited knowledge. Unlimited goodness. That's the sales pitch. That's the package. That's the God you were told cannot be questioned. But the second you combine those 3 traits in one being, the whole thing shatters. Not cracks. Shatters. Because unlimited power and unlimited goodness cannot coexist in a world designed with unlimited suffering unless you bend logic so hard it starts begging for mercy. If this God is all-knowing, he knew every detail of every tragedy before creating anything. Not the general outline. The details. Every scream, every trauma, every act of cruelty, every injustice. He knew it. If he's all-powerful, he could stop any of it instantly. Not eventually. Instantly. If he's all good, he would want to stop every bit of it. That's the definition of good, right? To minimize unnecessary suffering? So the moment you put those 3 definitions side by side, you're left with a system that doesn't make sense. Either he didn't know, so he's not omniscient. Or he knew but couldn't stop it, so he's not omnipotent. Or he knew, could stop it, and let it happen anyway, so he's not good. Pick one. You can't have all 3. The moment you try to keep them, the structure collapses. And don't worry, I can already hear the excuses people are trained to give. I've heard them 1,000 times. It's a mystery. God works in ways we don't understand. We can't question the divine plan. And I'm telling you right now, that's not theology, that's damage control. That's the spiritual equivalent of putting duct tape over a grenade and pretending it won't explode. The minute your belief system relies on shutting down questions instead of answering them, you're not dealing with truth, you're dealing with insulation. You're dealing with a doctrine that only survives if people don't press too hard. Think about this like an engineer, not a worshipper. Imagine designing a world where you already know billions will suffer, billions will fail, billions will feel abandoned, and you hit create anyway. What does that make you? You're not a savior. You're not a protector. You're the architect of the disaster. If you knowingly design a system where people fall into endless traps and then blame them for falling, that's not love. That's entrapment. That's the playbook of a dictator, not a deity. Now, let's go deeper. Let's talk about the contradiction at the heart of the so-called perfect God. Think about what it means for God to be a perfect. If a being is perfect, that being cannot change. Because any change implies improvement or decline. But if he can't change, is he really free? Can an unchanging, eternal, fixed being truly choose anything? Choice requires variability. Choice requires alternate possibilities. If God has only one eternal state, unchanged forever, he's not choosing goodness, he's stuck in it. And if he's stuck in it, why praise him for it? You don't praise a robot for doing what it was programmed to do. And let's push harder. If God is perfect and complete, then creating anything is impossible. Because the moment a perfect being wants something, the desire indicates a lack. Perfection cannot lack. Perfection cannot desire. Perfection cannot need. So why create a universe at all? What was the motivation? If the answer is love, that's a need. If the answer is glory, that's a need. If the answer is because he chose to, then choice implies change, and change breaks perfection. See the circle we're caught in? The contradictions form a cage around the idea of God. The more you define him, the less coherent he becomes. Let's talk about omnipotence, the big one, the crowd favorite. The idea that God can do everything. Everything. Unlimited power. That sounds impressive until you actually test it. Because omnipotence collapses the moment you ask one brutal question: can God create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it? If the answer is no, he's not all-powerful. If the answer is yes and he cannot lift it, he's also not all-powerful. But that's a trick question, people say. No. That's the definition being held to the standard it claims. If omnipotence can't survive its own internal logic, that's a problem with omnipotence, not with the question. And here's the twist people don't want to admit: the moment you say God cannot do logically impossible things, you've already put a limit above God. Logic becomes the higher law. God becomes a subject of logic, not the master of it. A truly omnipotent being should be able to override logic. But if he can't override logic, he's not absolute. Which means he's not God by the very definition religions use. Let's move. Let's hit another pressure point. Imagine you're told there's a being who created a world from nothing, knows everything, sees everything, controls everything, and yet somehow cannot be held responsible for anything that happens. That's the absurdity of classical theism. The Creator gets infinite credit for anything good and zero responsibility for anything bad. Humans do all the suffering, all the bleeding, all the struggling, but God gets all the praise. It creates a moral imbalance so massive that if a human claimed the same privilege, we'd call them delusional. But here's where it gets even darker. If God is omniscient, then he knew every human who would end up in suffering before creating them. He knew it. He watched the entire timeline in advance, saw every moment of agony, and still pressed the button. That's not ignorance. That's intention. That's design. That's deliberate. And once you see that, the idea of a good God disintegrates. A being who knows every outcome before acting is responsible for the outcomes. That's basic logic. But free will. Right? That's the escape hatch. The emergency lever. Let me be brutally honest, free will doesn't fix the problem. If God designed the world, designed human nature, designed the environment, designed the limitations, knew the outcomes, and created people anyway, that's not free will, that's predetermined behavior inside a controlled environment. You can't call it freedom when the Creator already knows the result and still builds the system. That's like building a maze, knowing exactly who will get lost forever, and then blaming the mouse. And don't forget this: if God knows the future is fixed. If the future is fixed, there's no freedom. If there's no freedom, moral responsibility collapses. And if moral responsibility collapses, the entire justification for punishment collapses. And trust me, when you strip away poetry, tradition, and cozy religious storytelling, the idea of an all-powerful God collapses into something that doesn't even make sense on its own terms. Not from science. Not from atheism. From pure logic. From the very definitions believers use to defend their God. That's where the implosion happens. Let's start with the most famous landmine, the omnipotence paradox. You've heard it. Can God create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it? And every time someone asks this, you can literally watch believers start sweating. Because they know this is not a trick. This is the definition of omnipotence being held to its own standard. If God cannot create such a stone, his power has limits. If he can create it and fails to lift it, his power also has limits. Either way, omnipotence is done. Over. Broken. But people hate this. They try to dodge it with the same rehearsed lines. That's a nonsense question. God can do all that is logically possible. You can't trap God in a contradiction. But the second they say that, listen closely, because they're not defending God. They're shrinking him. They're putting fences around his power. They're rewriting omnipotence into something completely different. If God can only do logically possible things, then logic is superior to God. Logic is the ceiling he can't break. Logic becomes the real God. Because God can only operate inside the rules logic allows. Let's not sugarcoat this. If you tell me God can't make square circles, can't make himself cease to exist, can't break the laws of non-contradiction, then say it clearly, God is not all-powerful. He's powerful, sure. He's impressive, okay. But he's not infinite power. He's bound. And a bound being is not God. Not the God of classical theism. Not the God of sermons. Not the God who supposedly sits outside time, space, and all constraints. Let me talk to you directly, yes, you, listening right now. Does it make sense to call an infinite being infinite when the first thing people do is draw borders around what he can and can't do? They'll say, God can do anything except the things we decide he can't, for his own good. That's not theology. That's patchwork. That's trying to save a broken idea by stuffing it with disclaimers. Now let's flip this entire thing around and go after the heart of the problem. If God is omnipotent, truly omnipotent, then he should be able to override logic itself. He should be able to exist and not exist at the same time. He should be able to be good and evil simultaneously. He should be able to create free beings whose future actions he doesn't know, while still knowing everything. He should be able to erase contradictions with a thought. That's what omnipotence means. Power with no limits. Power not confined by logic, physics, definition, or consistency. But if God can override logic, then nothing about him can be logically understood. Every claim about him collapses. You can't argue his good because logic no longer applies. You can't argue his consistent. You can't argue his perfect. You can't even argue he exists in a meaningful way. An omnipotent being that transcends logic erases every definition used to describe him. He becomes an undefined concept. A blank placeholder. A word with no meaning behind it. And if you try to avoid that chaos by saying, no, God follows logic, then congratulations, you just dethroned him. You just placed logic above him. You just admitted he's not absolute. You shrank him back into something finite, something structured, something that operates under limits. You clipped the wings off omnipotence and called it theology. Let's keep pushing because this gets darker the deeper you go. Omnipotence doesn't just clash with logic. It clashes with every other attribute God is supposed to have. If God is all-powerful, can he make himself cease to be all-powerful? If yes, then he can stop being God. If no, then he doesn't have total power. If he can change his nature, then his nature is not eternal. If he cannot change it, then he lacks a fundamental ability. Either way, you lose one of the core attributes. Think about immutability, the idea that God never changes. How can an all-powerful being be unable to change? That's a limitation. If God cannot choose to become something else, then he has boundaries. If he can choose to become something else, then he's not eternally perfect. Omnipotence destroys immutability. Immutability destroys omnipotence. The traits don't coexist. They kill each other. Let's drill into foreknowledge, too. If God knows the future perfectly, then the future is fixed. If the future is fixed, then God cannot change it. A future that has already been fully known cannot be altered, not even by God, because any alteration would make the prior knowledge incorrect. A being that knows the future exhaustively cannot exercise free will. And if God has no free will, his omnipotence is an illusion. Now ask yourself, how can an omnipotent being have no freedom? Let's talk about creation. If God is omnipotent, he could create a world with no suffering. He could create beings who are free but never choose evil. He could create joy without torment, growth without pain. Don't tell me he can't. If he can't, he's not omnipotent. If he can, but didn't, then his goodness is gone. This is the trap. Omnipotence doesn't help God, it exposes him. Every choice he makes becomes evidence of what he prefers. Every world he allows reflects his values. If God could eliminate suffering with a blink but doesn't, that's not a limitation. That's a decision. Let's go even deeper. If God is omnipotent, he can rewrite the rules of morality. He can declare anything good at any time. If he wants to, he could say torture is good and mercy is evil. If omnipotence is real, morality collapses into nothing more than divine preference. And if morality is divine preference, it's not objective. It's not eternal. It's not universal. It's arbitrary. It's whatever God feels like today. But if morality is not arbitrary, then even God must obey an external standard. And a being who obeys a standard is not the standard. And if God is not the standard, he is not the source of morality. The contradictions stack up like dominoes. Omnipotence versus logic. Omnipotence versus goodness. Omnipotence versus knowledge. Omnipotence versus immutability. Omnipotence versus free will, his and ours. Omnipotence versus morality. Omnipotence versus perfection. The attributes don't harmonize. They collide. And when attributes collide, the concept collapses. You can't have a triangle with 4 sides. You can't have a circle with angles. And you can't have a God who's bound by logic and above logic at the same time. Let me talk to the viewers the way I would if you were sitting right here in the studio with me. Look at how fast the idea falls apart once you actually interrogate it. Not from hate. Not from ego. From basic reasoning. You don't need philosophy. You don't need science. Just put the pieces together. A God who can do anything cannot be defined. A God who cannot be defined cannot have attributes. A God with no attributes cannot be described. A God who cannot be described cannot be worshipped. The foundation dissolves the moment you analyze it. Now let's go for the jugular. If God can do anything, then he can lie. If he cannot lie, then he cannot do anything. If he can lie, then nothing he reveals can be trusted. If he cannot lie, he has a limitation. Either omnipotence is fake, or revelation is unreliable. Pick one. You can't keep both. I want you to picture this exactly as it is. According to the doctrine, humans are created with a nature they did not choose. They're given instincts they did not design. They're placed in circumstances they did not control. They are born ignorant, fragile, and limited. Then these same humans are told they must navigate a cosmic moral system flawlessly. If they fail, they face consequences they never agreed to. That's not free will. That's entrapment wearing a divine mask. Look at the setup. Humans are made imperfect, then commanded to be perfect. They're made ignorant, then condemned for ignorance. They're born into a world allegedly designed by a being who knew every outcome, then blamed for arriving at the outcome he already foresaw. That's like building a car with no brakes, pushing it down a hill, and then screaming at it for crashing. It's absurd. And the doctrine doesn't even try to hide that the Creator supposedly knew everything ahead of time. He knew exactly who would fall, exactly who would fail, exactly who would be punished. But he created them anyway. And once you say that out loud, the entire moral structure breaks. Let me talk to you directly, because I want you to feel how scripted all this is. Imagine someone creates a simulation. In this simulation, the characters have flaws intentionally coded into them. They can't change their programming. They operate exactly as designed. Now imagine the programmer judges them for errors caused by his own code. That's not justice. That's manufactured guilt. That's a developer blaming the player for a bug in the game he wrote. The doctrine tries to cover this by inventing the idea of free will. But free will under total divine knowledge is a contradiction. If God already knows every future choice you will ever make, then you cannot make any other choice. The future is fixed. Your decisions are predetermined. A predetermined will is not free. And without free will, the system of sin collapses. Without sin, the system of punishment collapses. Without punishment, the system of salvation collapses. The whole thing is a house of cards pretending to be a fortress. But I want to pull you deeper. Let's talk about the idea of a test. People say life is a test, a trial, a proving ground. But a test that the examiner already knows the outcome of is not a test, it's theater. A test where the examiner designed the participants to fail is not education, it's sabotage. And calling it a test doesn't fix anything. It amplifies the absurdity. Because what kind of test has infinite consequences for finite mistakes? What kind of test punishes misunderstanding with eternal torment? What kind of test starts with the examiner already knowing who passes and who fails? Think about the logic. If God knows everything, He knew the exact second, the exact breath, the exact thought where someone would fail. If He didn't want them to fail, He could have made them differently. If He wanted them to fail, then He intentionally created beings with built-in doom. And if He didn't want them to fail but created them knowing they would fail, then He is indirectly responsible. There's no escape route here. Every path leads back to the designer. Let's talk about sin itself. What is sin supposed to be? A violation of God's law. A break in God's moral standard. But who created the standard? God did. Who created the impulse to break it? God did. Who created the environment that tempts people? God did. Who created the mind that struggles? God did. Who set the stakes? God did. And who punishes? God does. When one being writes all the rules, controls all the variables, and enforces all the consequences, the entire notion of sin becomes a rigged system. The same being who creates the crime also creates the punishment. That's not morality. That's control. And here's where the darker part comes in. If God designed humans with the capacity to sin, then sin is part of the design. If sin is part of the design, then it serves a purpose for the designer. And if it serves a purpose, then punishing people for fulfilling their design is not justice, it's exploitation. It's like handing a child a loaded gun, telling them not to touch it, leaving the room, watching through a camera, and then sentencing them to life in prison when they fail. You can't call that love. You can't call that guidance. You can't even call it justice. That's a trap. Let's go harder. If God truly didn't want sin to exist, He could simply not create beings capable of sinning. He could design a moral nature that naturally gravitates toward good. He could create instincts that align perfectly with what He wants. He could eliminate temptation entirely. He could write a universe where evil is literally impossible. Don't tell me He can't. Omnipotence means He can. If He chooses not to, that reveals preference. It reveals intention. It reveals design, not accident. So if sin exists, it's because God wanted it to exist. And if God wanted it, punishing humans for it becomes a twisted display of power. And let's talk about divine foreknowledge because that's the heart of the whole contradiction. If God knows the exact future, then your decisions are not choices, they are checkpoints. You're walking through a script. A script God wrote, approved, and greenlit. You're not choosing. You're playing your assigned role. And if you're playing a role and God judges you for the role He chose for you, then divine judgment is nothing more than blaming the puppet for the puppeteer's choreography. Some people try to escape this by saying God stands outside of time. But think about what that means. If God sees past, present, and future all at once, then the future is as fixed to Him as the past is to us. There is no possibility. No alternate path. No true freedom. A future known is a future locked. And a locked future is not chosen. It's unfolded. Deterministic. Prearranged. You cannot call a pre-written fate free will without twisting language until it screams. Let's hit another angle, divine justice. The doctrine says God is just. God is fair. God judges perfectly. But how is it just to judge beings whose weaknesses He created? How is it just to condemn beings for falling into traps He built? How is it just to hold finite creatures infinitely accountable? Justice requires symmetry, proportionality, balance. But the doctrine doesn't have any of that. It has absolutes. Infinite reward. Infinite punishment. For creatures who never asked to be created in the first place. And let me be very direct with you right now, if you create someone, you assume responsibility for the outcome. If you bring someone into existence, you are responsible for the consequences of that existence. You can't blame the created for the flaws of the creator. If a painter makes a flawed painting, the painting is not guilty. If a programmer writes buggy code, the code is not guilty. But religion flips this. The flaws of the creation become the sins of the creature. And the creator walks away spotless, untouchable, unquestionable. Let's talk about inherited sin, original sin, the idea that humanity is born fallen. That's one of the darkest concepts ever invented. Because it says you are guilty before doing anything. You carry the stain of something someone else did. The doctrine punishes you not for your actions, but for your nature. A nature you didn't choose. A nature you didn't shape. A nature supposedly built by God Himself. And this nature comes with a death sentence unless you follow exact rituals written in ancient texts. That's not spirituality. That's coercion. If God didn't want humanity to sin, He could have made beings incapable of sin. If God wanted humanity to sin, then sin is part of His plan. If God doesn't want sin but created beings who inevitably sin, then He created failure by design. Every version leads to the same conclusion: the Creator is responsible for the flaw, not the creature. I want you to visualize a courtroom with God as judge. Humanity stands in chains. The charges? Violating rules the judge wrote. The weaknesses? Installed by the judge. The temptations? Created by the judge. The world? Built by the judge. The outcomes? Foreknown by the judge. And the punishment? Delivered by the judge. That's not justice. That's a closed system. A loop. A self-reinforcing cycle where the designer blames the designed. The doctrine claims humans are born corrupt. Born broken. Born with a nature that tilts toward what God hates. Not because they chose it, but because they inherited it. Before they speak a word, before they think a thought, before they commit a single act, they're already guilty. That's the foundation. That's the starting line. You're told you're wrong before you've even begun. That's not morality. That's leverage. That's the foundation of control. Start with guilt, then build obedience from guilt. And here's the most shocking part. Once guilt is the foundation, everything built on top becomes unquestionable. If you're guilty from birth, then you're always indebted. Always obligated. Always inferior. And that's where divine morality becomes a tool. The system doesn't need to convince you God is right. It only needs to convince you that you're wrong. Once you accept that, everything else falls into place. Let me talk to you directly, because I want you awake for this part. When you're told that your desires, your instincts, your thoughts, your impulses are sinful, you're not being morally educated. You're being psychologically disarmed. You're being conditioned to distrust yourself. To look outside yourself for morality. To look upward for permission. And once you need permission from an invisible authority, the authority owns you. Every law, every command, every restriction becomes absolute not because it's good, but because its source is unquestionable. Now let's drill into how this system reinforces itself. The doctrine says God's ways are higher than your ways. That His morality is beyond human understanding. That you don't judge God, He judges you. At first glance, that sounds spiritual. But the moment you break it down, you see the mechanism. By placing God's morality beyond your comprehension, the doctrine makes it impossible to evaluate the system. You can't challenge it. You can't analyze it. You can't question it. The moment you ask why, the system fires back with because God said so. That shuts the door on every moral question. That turns morality into a top-down command structure where obedience is the highest virtue. Not compassion. Not reason. Not justice. Obedience. And obedience is the signature mark of authority, not morality. If morality came from goodness, it would be open to examination. It would invite understanding. But morality that requires blind obedience reveals itself as control disguised as virtue. Let's push deeper, because this is where the rot shows. The doctrine demands perfection from beings explicitly created imperfect. That's not morality. That's coercion. You're given a nature that breaks the rules, then punished for breaking the rules. You're told to be flawless, but built with flaws. And when you inevitably fail, the system says, see, you need God. It's a loop. A cycle engineered to produce dependence. Think about the brilliance of that structure. The doctrine creates the disease, sin, then offers the cure, obedience and devotion. And once the system defines both the disease and the cure, it owns the narrative. It owns the rules. It owns the blame. It owns the salvation. You don't get to negotiate. You don't get to question the setup. You just get to participate in it. Now, let's talk about fear, because fear is the fuel that keeps this machine running at full speed. You're told God is loving, but also that God is the judge, the executioner, the enforcer of eternal punishment. You're told he forgives, but you're also told he condemns. The message is mixed on purpose. Because fear makes morality absolute. Fear reinforces obedience stronger than love ever could. And if you disobey, you will face consequences, the doctrine whispers. Not temporary consequences. Not symbolic consequences. Eternal consequences. Infinite punishment for finite actions. That's the most disproportionate justice imaginable. And the moment justice becomes infinite, morality stops being about ethics and becomes about power. Eternal punishment is the ultimate threat. It is the nuclear bomb of spiritual coercion. Once you believe in infinite consequences, you'll accept any rule, any command, any moral system, just to avoid the threat. Let's go into the architecture of this. Imagine a courtroom where the judge is also the lawmaker. The judge is also the witness. The judge is also the prosecutor. The judge decides the crime. The judge defines the punishment. The judge determines guilt. The judge enforces the sentence. There are no checks. No balances. No appeals. No negotiation. And the defendant? Created by the same judge, with every flaw coded into them. That's divine morality as defined by the doctrine. The structure is not moral. The structure is absolute rule. Let's break open another layer, the idea of holiness. You're told God is holy, perfect, pure, untainted. But think about what holiness actually means in the doctrine. Holiness means separate, untouchable, above, beyond. That definition isn't about goodness. It's about distance. It's about superiority. Holiness creates a hierarchy where the deity is morally untouchable, while humanity is morally defective by default. And once the deity is untouchable, every critique becomes blasphemy. Every question becomes rebellion. Every doubt becomes sin. And here's where things get even darker. If God is morally untouchable, then any action attributed to him, no matter how monstrous, gets rebranded as good simply because he did it. If humans do it, it's evil. If God does it, it's holy. That is not morality. That is authoritarianism. That is theocracy in philosophical clothing. You can see it in the ancient stories, where the deity commands destruction, suffering, and violence, but the doctrine insists it's righteous because of the source. The same act of murder, genocide, cruelty, changes moral value depending on who performs it. That's not morality. That's hierarchy of power masquerading as ethics. Let me speak directly to you again. When a system requires two sets of moral rules, one for the creator, one for the creation, this is not about justice. It's about dominance. Because morality that shifts depending on the actor is not morality. It's permission. It's exemption. And once you give an authority exemption from morality, that authority stops being moral entirely. Holiness becomes a shield that hides actions that would normally be condemned. This double standard travels through the whole structure. If a human demands worship, they're arrogant. If God demands worship, it's righteous. If a human punishes others indefinitely, they're monstrous. If God punishes eternally, it's justice. If a human demands total obedience, they're controlling. If God demands total obedience, it's holy. When the same behavior flips from evil to good depending on whose name is attached, you don't have morality. You have power dynamics. Let's drill into another pressure point, the way morality is tied to identity rather than action. The doctrine says all humans fall short. All humans are sinners. All humans fail to meet the standard. That means your moral status doesn't come from what you do, but from what you are. Your nature determines your guilt before you act. That's not ethics. That's condemnation built into existence. And once morality becomes identity-based, the system gains complete control over your self-perception. You're not wrong because of your actions. You're wrong because of your being. And once you believe that, the only path to worth becomes obedience. The only path to approval becomes submission. The only path to redemption becomes dependence on the very authority that defined you as broken. Let's tear open the incentive system behind this. The doctrine says obedience is good because God commands it, not because the action itself is inherently good. And disobedience is bad because God forbids it, not because the action causes harm. That flips morality from objective ethics into divine preference. The system becomes a list of commands, not a structure of goodness. Killing is wrong when humans do it. Killing is righteous when God orders it. The morality is not in the action, it's in the authority behind it. That's the signature of authoritarian moral systems. Actions are morally neutral. Obedience is the real virtue. Disobedience is the real crime. The content of the action becomes irrelevant. Only loyalty matters. Let's push even harder. When the deity defines morality, morality becomes detached from reason. You're not asked to understand why something is wrong. You're just asked to comply. Blindly. Without context. Without explanation. That means morality becomes arbitrary. If the deity changed his mind tomorrow, the moral law would flip instantly. And you would be expected to follow without question. That is not goodness. That is control. And once morality is detached from reason, human beings become unable to evaluate actions independently. Instead of asking, is this good, they're conditioned to ask, is God okay with this? That substitution kills critical thinking. It kills ethical reasoning. It kills moral autonomy. You become an extension of divine command rather than a moral agent. Let's drag the spotlight straight into the heart of the contradiction that exposes the entire foundation of the classical God concept. I want you to visualize the ancient landscape exactly as the doctrine describes it. A world full of violence. A world full of plagues. Entire tribes wiped out. Cities burning. Infants dying. Women taken as spoils. Floods drowning everything. Fire raining from the sky. Divine commands for extermination. Commands for sacrifice. Commands for blood. These are not accidents. These are not metaphors. These are explicit acts attributed directly to the deity the doctrine calls good, just, and loving. That's the contradiction. Not philosophical. Structural. A being whose actions would be considered atrocities if any human did them is declared righteous simply because the being is called God. Let me talk directly to you for a second because I want you to feel this. If a human king drowned the world, he'd be called a monster. If a human general ordered genocide, he'd be tried as a war criminal. If a human leader tortured people eternally for disobedience, he'd be the villain in every story ever written. But attach the label God, and suddenly all of that transforms into justice, holiness, righteousness, and in mysterious ways. That switch doesn't come from morality. That switch comes from hierarchy. The doctrine doesn't judge actions, it judges the rank of the actor. Pull that thread for just a moment and watch what happens. If morality changes depending on who does the action, then morality is not objective. It's not absolute. It's not grounded in goodness. It's grounded in authority. That is the core that collapses the whole doctrine. Divine morality becomes divine dictatorship disguised as benevolence. Now let's go deeper. The paradox isn't just why does God allow evil? That's the surface level debate. The real paradox is why does the doctrine praise acts as holy when they would be evil if done by anyone else? That's the real fracture. The paradox of divine evil. The dark side of the Epicurean problem people pretend doesn't exist. If God is all good, his action should reflect goodness. But the scripture attributed to him shows destruction, favoritism, wrath, punishment for thought crimes, punishment for doubt, punishment for being born into the wrong tribe, punishment for the sins of ancestors, and punishment for the laws he himself designed. These are not the behaviors of a benevolent being. These are the behaviors of an absolute ruler with no accountability, no limitations, and no one above him to question him. And if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then he doesn't just allow suffering, he designs it. He implements it. He chooses it. Every plague, every famine, every disaster. If he didn't want those outcomes, he could eliminate them. He could rewrite the entire system. He could make a world without pain. He could make humans incapable of cruelty. He could make justice without suffering. But the doctrine insists he didn't. That's not passive allowance. That's active preference. Let's push harder because this is where it becomes undeniable. If God is good, he would never create a world that includes natural disasters that kill indiscriminately. Yet the doctrine insists he did. If God is good, he would never design creatures with flaws they can't fix, then punish them eternally for those flaws. Yet the doctrine insists he does. If God is good, he wouldn't demand worship under threat. Yet the doctrine claims he requires it. Goodness doesn't demand praise. Goodness doesn't threaten consequences for doubt. Goodness doesn't attach love to obedience. And here comes the part that hits the deepest, the part almost no one dares to say. If God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he knew every horrifying event in history before he created the universe. Every torture, every murder, every disease, every child scream, every broken body, every dying gasp. Not just in general. Every specific one. The exact details. The exact timing. The exact victims. And he pressed the create button anyway. That means every tragedy was part of the blueprint. Part of the architecture. Not a bug. A feature. You can't call a being good in any meaningful sense if that being deliberately builds a world containing suffering he could remove. A being who could eliminate pain but chooses not to is not benevolent. A being who could prevent atrocity but permits it is not compassionate. A being who creates beings knowing they will suffer is not loving. That's the contradiction that the Epicurean paradox exposes so cleanly. The kind of contradiction that no sermon can patch with poetry. The kind no preacher can drown with emotional music or comforting stories. Let's take it further. If the deity commands genocide and calls it righteous, then righteousness becomes meaningless. If the deity murders infants and calls it justice, then justice becomes meaningless. If the deity uses fear to enforce obedience, then love becomes meaningless. The doctrine hijacks moral language and twists it until the words lose any objective definition. Good no longer means good. It means approved by God. Evil that doesn't mean evil. It means disapproved by God. You're no longer following morality. You're following the preferences of a cosmic monarch. Let me put it in blunt terms you can't dodge. Under the classical doctrine, morality is not grounded in good or harm or reason or empathy. It's grounded in commands. And commands can be arbitrary. Commands can contradict each other. Commands can justify anything if the commander holds absolute power. That's why the doctrine can take acts like mass destruction and call them holy. The morality doesn't come from the action. It comes from the authority behind the action. Once you see that, the God of classical theism stops being a moral ideal and starts looking like an unchallengeable ruler whose will defines morality simply because he is the one with power. That's the underlying structure the Epicurean paradox was attacking from the beginning. Not because Epicurus hated God. Because the God being described cannot logically exist as both all-powerful and all-good. The two traits conflict when applied to a world filled with suffering. Let's talk directly again, because I want you to feel the weight of the contradiction. If God is all-powerful, he could eliminate all suffering instantly. If he is all-good, he would want to eliminate all suffering instantly. Yet suffering exists. Not small suffering. Vast, unimaginable suffering. Suffering that achieves nothing. Suffering that destroys innocent lives. Suffering that serves no moral lesson. The Epicurean paradox isn't a gotcha. It's a spotlight on the core myth. A myth that collapses when confronted with the world the doctrine itself describes. The doctrine tries to escape by saying God's ways are higher. That phrase is the emergency exit. The eject button. The intellectual escape hatch. The line that shuts down all further questioning. But the moment you invoke that, you're admitting the moral system is inconsistent. You're saying the actions attributed to God violate human morality, so you redefine morality upward to protect the doctrine. That's not solving the contradiction. That's burying it under dogma. Let's get even more direct. If you judge God's actions as good because he is God, you're not using morality. You're using a ranking system. A hierarchy where the top being is automatically right. That's not ethics. That's obedience disguised as virtue. That's authoritarian logic disguised as holiness. Now, consider the ancient events again. The doctrine says God drowned the world. God burned cities. God ordered conquests. God killed firstborn children. God punished entire populations for the actions of a few. God demanded sacrifices. God inflicted plagues. If any human leader did this, they would be labeled the worst villain in history. But when the doctrine attributes it to God, it becomes sacred. That reversal, where evil becomes good if God does it, is the clearest sign that the moral system is not moral. It is power-based. A deity-centered morality where the only difference between righteous and wicked is who performs the act. The Epicurean paradox slices through this illusion. Not gently. Brutally. It says, if a being allows evil while possessing the power to stop it, that being is not good. If a being wants to stop evil but cannot, that being is not omnipotent. If a being neither wants to stop evil nor is able to, that being is not God. And if a being is both able and willing to stop evil, evil would not exist. Every branch of that argument exposes a contradiction in the classical God concept. Every option destroys one divine attribute. Every path collapses the structure. I want you to picture this like you're sitting in front of a locked vault. Everyone tells you there's treasure inside. Gold. Diamonds. Whatever. They tell you the vault is unbreakable, impenetrable, perfect. But the second you start examining the metal, you see cracks. You start tapping, and the whole thing echoes hollow. You put a little pressure on the hinges, and the door shakes. And by the time you press your hand against it, the vault doesn't just open, it collapses into dust. That's the classical God concept when held up to logical scrutiny. It doesn't withstand pressure. It disintegrates the moment you take the definition seriously. Let me talk directly to you right now, because you need to hear this clearly. A God who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, eternal, unchanging, morally perfect, and also the creator of everything cannot exist as one coherent being. Not because science disproves him. Not because atheism disproves him, but because the definitions destroy each other. So let's tear through the heart of it. The idea that God exists as a necessary being relies on the claim that the universe needs a cause, and that cause must be God. But if God exists outside time, outside change, outside cause and effect, then calling him a cause is nonsense. A cause requires time. A cause requires change. A cause requires before and after. But if God is timeless and changeless, he cannot cause anything. A timeless being cannot perform actions. An unchanging being cannot transition from not creating to creating. So if God is timeless, creation is impossible. And if creation is impossible, the doctrine collapses. But let's not stop. Let's dig into omniscience, because this is where another massive contradiction explodes. If God knows everything, every future action, every future thought, every possible timeline, then God cannot think. Not in the way people imagine. Thought requires movement, comparison, evaluation, consideration. But a being who already knows everything cannot think. There's nothing new to process, nothing to decide, nothing to discover. Which means omniscience kills consciousness. A being who cannot learn, cannot grow, cannot change mental states, cannot be conscious in any meaningful sense. So the more omniscience you give God, the less like a mind he becomes. The less like a person he becomes. The less coherent the concept becomes. Now add omnipotence into the equation, and the contradictions multiply. If God is omnipotent, he should be able to change his own nature. But if he can change his nature, he's not immutable. And if he cannot change his nature, he's not omnipotent. These are not clever tricks. These are direct logical collisions. The attributes cannot coexist. You cannot have an all-powerful, unchanging being. You cannot have an all-knowing, free being. You cannot have an eternal, conscious being. The traits destroy each other. Let's push further, because this is where the doctrine collapses into something even stranger. If God is perfect, then God has no needs, no lack, no desire. But if God has no desire, why create anything? Why act? Why speak? Why intervene? Action requires motive. Motive requires desire. Desire requires lack. But perfection has no lack. So a perfect being cannot act. A perfect being cannot choose. A perfect being cannot create. So the moment you define God as perfect, you erase his ability to create the world. Every road leads to contradiction. Let's examine another one. If God is purely spiritual, immaterial, without body or form, then he cannot perform actions that require interaction with the physical world. A non-physical being cannot push, pull, shape, split, speak, appear, descend, or manifest. Every verb in the scriptures contradicts the nature they assign to God. Actions require energy transfer. Energy transfer requires form or presence. A formless being cannot act in time and space. If God interacts with the world, he cannot be immaterial. If he is immaterial, he cannot interact. Another collapse. Now let's tear open the idea of moral perfection. If God is morally perfect, then he must always choose the morally best option. But if he must act morally, he lacks freedom. He cannot choose otherwise. A being who cannot choose otherwise is not free. A being without freedom is not omnipotent. And if he can choose otherwise, if he has the capacity to choose evil, then he's not morally perfect. Another contradiction. And here's another one. If God's nature determines his actions, then God's actions are not choices. They're consequences of his nature. If God's nature cannot be changed, then God's actions are determined. If God's actions are determined, God does not have free will. If God has no free will, he is not personal. And if he is not personal, he cannot intend anything. A being without intention cannot design. A being without design cannot create purposefully. A being without purpose cannot form relationships. The God being described collapses into philosophical abstraction, not an actual mind. Let's push into the nature of omnipresence. If God is everywhere, then he is also in every evil, every crime, every act of suffering. If God is everywhere, then he is in prisons, in violent acts, in the bloodstream of murderers, in every drop of poison, in every collapsing building, in every dying breath. If the doctrine insists on omnipresence, then God is inseparable from evil. If the doctrine denies that, then omnipresence is false. Another contradiction. And here's the part that gets even heavier. If God is the creator of everything, then God created the very laws of logic. But if God created logic, then God can break logic. If God can break logic, then no statement about God can be trusted, including the statement that God is good, just, perfect, or real. So to protect the doctrine, people say, no, God cannot break logic. But if God cannot break logic, then he is bound by logic. And anything bound by a higher law is not absolute. Anything not absolute is not God. You see how every door you open leads to another wall? You see how every attempt to save the doctrine creates another contradiction? That's not coincidence. That's structural failure. The God being described is an impossible combination of mutually exclusive traits. The more attributes you add, the more fragile the concept becomes. Eventually, the contradictions pile up so densely that the only thing holding God together is emotional attachment, not logical coherence. Let me talk directly to you again, because this is the part most people feel but never articulate. The doctrine depends on you not asking how these traits fit together. It depends on you accepting definitions individually and never putting them side by side. But the moment you place omnipotence next to omniscience, perfection next to freedom, timelessness next to causality, immateriality next to interaction, justice next to creation, you see the circuitry. You see the conflict. You see the contradiction behind the curtain. And that's the moment the spell breaks, when the God described cannot even exist by the rules of his own theology. Not disproven by science. Disproven by his own definitions. The being is both changeless and choosing. Both timeless and acting. Both perfect and wanting. Both omnipresent and morally separate from evil. Both immaterial and intervening. Both omnipotent and limited by logic. Both omniscient and free. These attributes cannot coexist. They annihilate each other. The classical God isn't just morally contradictory. He's conceptually impossible. This is the part the doctrine never wanted dragged into the light. This is the part no sermon can patch. The definitions destroy the definition. The attributes dismantle the being they are supposed to describe. Thank you for staying with me until the very end and daring to explore what most people are too afraid to examine.